I'm Sam Saxon for Thom Hartmann in Washington, D.C. Here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. Today, Republicans on Capitol Hill grilled ex-IRS Chief Stephen Miller about his former employer's targeting of conservative groups. GOP leaders say that they just want the truth, but what are they really after? We'll talk about this and more in tonight's Big Picture Rumble. And Republican Party emerged from its 2008 defeat as powerful as ever. How did this happen, and who backed the right's resurgence? Tom will ask Fang in tonight's Conversations with Great Minds. It's Friday, which means it's time to rumble. Joining me for tonight's Big Picture Rumble are Mark Harold, libertarian commentator and attorney; Case Steiger, managing editor at The Raw Story; Horace Cooper, conservative commentator and senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Let's start by talking about the congressional hearings on the IRS scandal today. I want to play the opening statements here by Congressman Dave Camp of Michigan. Here, let's play them.
Listening to the nightly news, this appears to be just the latest example of a culture of cover-ups and political intimidation in this administration. It seems like the truth is hidden from the American people just long enough to make it through an election. The American people have a right to the truth, to a government that delivers the facts, good or bad, no matter what.
Horace, what's this truth that they're going to discover? I mean, I think Republicans are already biased going into this about what they want to discover. What do you think is going to actually be discovered here?
IRS abuses, using an organization as powerful as it is a very, very serious problem.
Like when Bush did it.
And when you are looking at the administration where it happens, you have to ask how it came about. Now, one of two things needs to happen. This administration could come right out in favor of a new taxpayer Bill of Rights, or they can fight and defend the choices and decisions that have been made, and they're going to own these excesses.
What does this have to do with the taxpayer Bill of Rights?
The IRS has been abusing its responsibilities to carry out. The organization that I'm with, 3 out of the last 5 years has been audited. Not a 501c3, not a 501c4, but a 501c3.
Isn't the bigger scandal here the way that 501c4s have completely destroyed our elections when it comes down to it, and Congress's inability to regulate them properly, which has left it on the IRS to try and, this is no man's task, trying to regulate these groups.
Right, exactly. I mean, I can't say that it's a good idea necessarily to target groups just because you don't agree with them ideologically, but I think that Citizens United really opened the doors to possible abuse. And it's really clear that the IRS, even if they had gone about this in a more balanced way without targeting Tea Party groups directly, would have ended up going after conservative groups more disproportionately just because that's where more of the money was.
Exactly.
And so it just seems like Republicans are seizing on this. They're really excited about having a real live scandal on their hands. But it does show that, this really has opened the door to abusive political spending.
Well, that's the reason why when asked, are there a disproportionate number of right-of-center groups being selected for audits, the answer should have been yes, and here's why. Not, no, it's not happening. If people are telling you that, it's anecdotal. That misleading statement made to Congress is part of the reason this whole thing is happening.
Mark, do you think this is really a scandal that goes up a pretty high level of administration officials trying to influence the election by using the IRS to target certain political organizations?
I don't know that it goes up that high. This is a real problem, though. I've always said taxes are about social control to some degree. You take people's money, and when they do things you like, you give it more of it back to them. This is a real problem if the IRS is targeting on ideological grounds. I think we could all agree on that. What I see this is really about, this has to do with Obamacare. A lot of this is Obamacare. They want to and I'm saying I think this is a strategy. I'm not weighing in on it. I'm saying I think the strategy here overall is to discredit the IRS.
On the right to discredit
I'm just saying, I think this is the strategy. If they're excited about it.
The IRS has done the things necessary to discredit the IRS.
But the reason you would want, let's say that the IRS is wrong here. The reason you really want to bring that out and really bring it to the American people, not just because of the injustice, but putting on my political strategic hat, you want to try to discredit the IRS as much as you can because they're the ones that are going to be doing Obamacare. And I think that's what this is really about. If it's going further than just the congressional hearings, I think that's what this is really about.
Well, how do you get a circumstance where the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors is briefing reporters about the Koch brothers tax filings.
But that's the
that
thing.
kind of disclosure and the particular use of the information makes people think you're accessing and abusing the process.
Why, if they're abusing this process, why didn't they go after the Koch groups? Why didn't they go after the Rove groups? Why did they just randomly pick these small ones that seem to be flagged, the tiny ones? If they were really trying to influence the election, they would have gone after the ones who were really spending all the money. Isn't that the smoking gun that this was obviously
having worked in a large federal bureaucracy, I understand that quite often it's a lot easier to use that force on those that can't respond nearly as well and nearly as effectively. You can bring a swarm of IRS agents against a smaller group and intimidate them. What you can't do is that against someone like Karl Rove's group. And to the point, had they simply answered the question, yes, we are disproportionately going after those groups because that's what we think the problem lies, they wouldn't find themselves in this situation.
I mean, the IRS is a monster as far as law enforcement. It is. I mean, how did they get Capone? They didn't get him about his crimes and murders. They went after taxes. Tax enforcement can be very intrusive. It can be very rough. I mean, there's no doubt about it. If they're targeting people because of their ideological beliefs, that's wrong.
Was there this outrage on, Horace, were you outraged in 2004 when the NAACP was targeted by the IRS?
It's interesting. Actually, at the time...
Were you ready for this? Were you ready?
We were. At the time, we said that we have to be very, very careful when dealing with groups that have this strong historic...
We have to be very, very careful.
Yeah.
Now what are you saying?
What did the chairman, Julian Bond, then chairman, say today? What happened with us was different, but go after these groups precisely because they're conservative. That kind of hypocrisy we did not exhibit, and we continue not to exhibit.
And I think the point is that the very reason that nonprofit groups were banned from political activity in the first place is because there were right-wing organizations in the 1950s funneling money into trying to defeat LBJ. So this is a long-running history.
But part of that has to do with the other side of Citizens United, the 8-to-1, not going into effect, and we can blame whoever we want. Citizens United, it's the boogeyman right now of the left, but it's a lot less potent, and I think everybody would admit this, if the 8-to-1 side, not the 5-4 side that created it, the 8-to-1, the transparency, you get the transparency in there, and a lot of the problems with Citizens United really dissipate.
So, Horace, don't you think that these organizations that are social welfare organizations, do you think they're abusing the process right now?
Actually, we don't have evidence that they're abusing the process. What we have evidence of is the mere fact
of the election season of these social welfare organizations saying we must defeat Obama.
How is evidence that if they had Tea Party, freedom, the U.S. Constitution, or anything like that in their title, they got flagged.
I'm not talking about the IRS right now.
What are we talking about?
I'm talking about these organizations that are abusing their exempt status.
Do I agree that there are organizations that abuse their status? Yes, I think that there are some organizations.
And you think the IRS should step up enforcement on that stuff?
I have no problem with requiring people to comply with the law. What I have a problem with is the IRS not doing that, but singling out people on ideological grounds.
And we should abolish the IRS to begin with. And if you don't have deductions, you don't have to worry about all this. Everybody pays a fair tax or flat tax. You get rid of all of this problem with the IRS targeting people.
Mark for president.
So here we go. We're trying to have a debate on the IRS, and you don't think the IRS should exist.
I should have just said abolish it and moved on.
Let's move on. Let's talk about the Department of Justice and this massive snoop on the Associated Press, 100 offices, 100 reporters targeted, 20 offices. We've seen calls on Capitol Hill for investigations into this. We've seen some Republicans respond with outrage to this. Mark Sanford today said this was a massive overstep of boundaries. I want to know what the strategy is on the right going into examining this story. Are they really outraged by it? Because, you know, they've been fairly quiet so far in how this administration has been so forceful in going after whistleblowers and how the Bush administration was. Do they really want to find out what happened? Do they want to exploit it for political gain, as they seem to be with IRS or Benghazi, or do they just really not care?
Okay, first of all, 4 people died in Benghazi, and to say that people who stand up and talk about that are only doing it for politics, I think is insulting to them. Secondly, the IRS has a record of abusing people and organizations, and to stand up against them and say that that's politics is also insulting. But the third point is this. The constituency of the media, that is Mr. Obama's constituency. Our natural tendency might be to sit back, get some popcorn, and watch and see what happens.
Do you have a problem with what the DOJ did?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Mark, what do you think?
Sure, you have to have. I think you have to have a problem with what they did here. You know, if the question is why is the right not as upset about this as it is about other things, I think just what Horace said. I think you're basically stepping back a little bit and saying, look, there's been this love relationship with the press and the president, and the AP is going to take care of this themselves. The journalists are basically going to take care of this themselves without having to fuel it the same way as other things if they don't have hearings and this sort of thing. This is a major problem.
They will have hearings.
Imagine if you're the confidential informant or whatever for a reporter, they can find, if they can get the phone records of that reporter and see who they were talking to the week before the big story hit, they'll figure out who the source was. This is serious stuff.
Yeah.
I agree that it's serious, but I think that what we actually need to look at is that this happened thanks in part to policies that were pushed by Republicans. You know, allowing wiretaps, allowing email searches, those kinds of things are policies that were pushed by Republicans, and I think it's time for Republicans to face up to what
To crack down on whistleblowers is what this investigation is trying to do. To crack down on whistleblowers, this is an unprecedented use of this kind of, or leakers, this is an unprecedented use of a warrant to search as far and wide. There is no example during the Bush administration for anything like this. Now, if you were telling me that the goal here was somehow to protect national security, I would still say I want to talk to that federal judge and ask him what was he thinking or what was he smoking when he said just any numbers you want, any locations you want, just give me as many names as you want and I'm going to write a blank check. That's not how a warrant is supposed to work.
I wouldn't worry as much about the partisan thing. Did the right do it? Is the left doing it? This is how people in power act. This is why you need the press. And if they can ever get a hold of the press and really intimidate them, we're not going to find out about these abuses of power in first place. And that's the real problem here. I don't think this is liberal. This is liberal conservative. I think this is how people in power act when they can
and
get away with it.
And when in
2007,
in 2007, when this bill was introduced, Senator Obama supported it. In 2009, when it was reintroduced, President Obama tried to water it down. It seems to be something that goes beyond politics, as Mark said. It just has to do with a very powerful executive right now.
It absolutely does, and I think regardless of where we're at with the policies now, I think it really shows that whoever is in power is going to use them for their maximum political gain.
AP, Benghazi, and IRS all show the limits to having a government that's so huge that it's very, very difficult to manage. Now, if you don't believe that, then you have to be sympathetic to the argument that this administration
you don't think an IRS should exist like Mark thinks that. Then
the
I don't
IRS
see how
not exist.
malfeasance in the IRS.
You don't have a lot of choices here. Either you say that they're out of control, a rogue agency, or they're following orders and doing bad things. You don't have a lot of middle ground.
You can say that it's a decent institution that has a couple of bad apples working for it at this one time, but more of tonight's Big Picture Rumble after the break.
Modern Russia was built on coal. Fuel for its factories. Coke for its steel.
Oh my God, is it hot?
And heat for its people. Join me, James Brown, to meet the men who spend their lives underground and work in one of the world's most dangerous professions.
Glad to see you.
Hearts of Coal on RT.
The real damage and complexity of this oil spill was not something that you could grasp just by looking at dirty birds.
We have between 4 to 5 million people in this directly affected area of the coast, and it's pretty clear why it's not being reported, because BP can't afford to have it reported.
All along the Gulf Coast are clean, they are safe, and they are open for business.
BP is the single largest oil contributor to the Pentagon. The U.S. war machine is heavily reliant upon BP and their oil.
This is a huge step backwards for democracy. It's a step forward for oligarchy.
Corexit is toxic.
Because it looked a lot like spraying in Vietnam. It was not a picture that either the government or BP really wanted to have out there.
I don't want dispersants to be the Agent Orange of this oil spill.
Welcome back. Joining me for tonight's Big Picture Rumble are Mark Harold, Kay Steiger, and Horace Cooper. Welcome back to the show. Is it Steiger or Steger?
Steiger.
Steiger, got it right. Okay. So according to the most recent CBO analysis, our deficit is shrinking fast. We really don't have a deficit problem. It's fallen by $600 billion. A lot of it thanks to Obamacare, which brought health care costs lower by $49 billion. New York Times has a new analysis out. Now, all this report about the deficit comes as austerity is being pushed more and more by conservatives and even some Democrats. New York Times analysis found that, quote, the nation's unemployment rate would probably be nearly a point lower, roughly 6.5%, had Washington not cut spending and raised taxes as it has since 2011. And here's a graphic coming up showing the comparison between unemployment rates with and without austerity right there. So why isn't it time to pull back from the austerity here? Then keep pushing it?
Absolutely, and the first way we start with that is to redefine your misuse of the term. Now, you just read the quote, and it said two things. They cut spending and raised taxes. The tax hikes were significant, and they were real. The cuts were nominal.
Which tax hikes are you talking about? Are you talking about the payroll tax hike, or are you talking about the minuscule tax hike on the richest people in the country?
I'm talking about the tax hike that's also part of Obamacare on medical devices.
Haven't gone into effect.
Some of them have, yes, actually this year. And also the sun-tanning tax, all of those things are kicking in this particular year, in fact.
The sun-tanning tax is what's ruining our economy.
There are examples of the taxes that are, in fact, already in place, as well as the tax that he said was going to be a millionaire tax that actually reached down to people less than half of that amount. And then you've got the payroll tax added on top of that. This is a significant tax hike on this economy with very, very modest. That's the definition of austerity that I described that is actually happening, and we are in favor of something instead, which would be lowering taxes and encouraging growth.
Well, so I think what this really shows is that long-term planning around debt and deficit is crazy, especially when you have a real problem where people are out of work. We saw, states cut back lots and lots of programs and workers in their budgets over the last few years, and it's had a really damaging effect on the economy. And I completely agree. Had we not done all of that, we probably would be in a much better and more robust economic situation right now.
Mark, are you going to give credit to the president for cutting the deficit faster than at any rate since World War II?
Well, the credit would be because there's so much practice. Here's what happens. The Bush administration had huge government. The Obama is huge government. If you practice long enough with overtaxing people, completely overtaxing them, and having the government rise and rise and get bigger and bigger, sooner or later, with all that practice of taxing people too much and having too big a government, you will find a way, so the numbers fit, that you can bring it and it's more deficit neutral. I mean, you'll find a way sooner or later.
More efficient is what you're saying.
It's not more efficient, though, because you're still taking so much money from people.
You would call the top tax rate dropping from 90% down to 35, 37, 39%, taxing people to death.
It's a good start.
But you have to. It's called taxing people to death.
No, we are taxing people to death because you're after ridiculous numbers. You're like, well, it's not 90, it's 40. 40 is okay. 40 is way too high.
Exactly.
It's way too high.
Exactly.
And the other thing about it is you have to remember a couple things. One, the White House and the CBO have different definitions of baseline, and two, the way the tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, are either there or not, impact these numbers.
And the 90% tax rate was never paid by all of the people that it was supposedly assessed against.
When you say that 40% is too high, when you say that 40% is too high, what are you comparing it to? Just some magic number in your head of what it should be, or the economic reality of where tax rates usually are versus economic growth? Because historically, higher tax rates have led to higher economic growth and better wealth equality.
That is absolutely not true. I know you guys use that stat here on this program all the time. Heritage Foundation and a number, the Joint Committee on Taxation.
You've already lost.
Have often refuted this with factual analysis of what was really going on.
So go ahead. What is that factual analysis?
You count war activities heading out of World War II.
Still government spending.
You count war activities that led out of World War II as the equivalent of government space. There was actual productive activity happening. There was equipment making. There was a need for investment in those kinds of
road
things.
building,
what we do,
school
that's
building.
not what we're doing. That's not what we're doing today.
Because you won't let
no.
it.
I'm saying what you are doing isn't actual investment and isn't the kind of thing that can lead to economic growth.
So you would support actual investment?
Sure. Private sector investment would be something great to have happen.
Do you think Horace would support
private sector investment?
I mean, I don't think he's a big fan of the Department of Energy's investment in some private sector.
I'm a huge critic.
Wait, because you're assuming sometimes that government's out there to solve all the problems. And if you take enough money from people, you might be able to make that work. But there's still economic liberty. And when you don't just take people's money, even if you can make it balance in some balance sheet, it doesn't matter. They're talking about economic liberty. When you have to give more of your money away, you work longer for the government each year, and they make decisions for you.
You're right. We should be against people having their money taken away, which brings me to the next topic about fast food workers. And a new study here, a new survey commissioned by this fast food workers campaign, shows that 84% of those surveyed said that their employees engaged in practices that amount to what the group has identified as theft. They're pretty much stealing wages, making people clock in early, not paying them for overtime, everything like that. All this is backdropped now by these growing hunger strikes that have been going, or not hunger strikes, sorry, wrong problem there. Growing fast food workers strikes, New York, Chicago, Detroit. They're asking for $15 minimum wage, currently $7.25. If minimum wage kept up with what it was in the 60s, it'd be about $10. Let me finish, $10. If it kept up with productivity, it'd be up, up at $20. Mark, what's the point of having a job if that job isn't going to pay you a wage to live on?
Well, the point of the job is, should they get $15? I'll say this, if they can get $15. The government should stay out of this. I mean, you want minimum wage, I'm against minimum wage. But saying they want 15, let's say the minimum wage was 10. If they can get the extra $5, if they privately, collective bargaining can get that because their services are that valuable to the company and the company cannot find somebody else to do it, they'll get their $15. Everyone in the market doesn't make minimum wage. If all people were interchangeable, everybody would make minimum wage. People get paid more by what they bring to a company.
I'm talking about fast food workers.
Absolutely.
These fast food companies are very profitable.
Yes, and furthermore, a lot of states have actually rolled back workers' abilities to collectively bargain and organize. So I think that's actually a problem.
But they're going to. But when the rates go way up, the food prices are going to go up too. Less people are going to eat there. They're not going to need as many employees. It's not just some magic thing where you can just hand people, take them from $8 an hour to $15, and nothing's going to change. But it's going to drive the prices of the food up.
Stop employers from taking the wages that they are supposedly earning.
They shouldn't be cheating people. I'm not talking about making them clock in and all that. Those are unfair practices. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just this idea that they should get $15 because they want $15,
but
and it would make them.
Whether it's blatant theft by not paying people for overtime or making them clock in earlier or whatever, or later, we are seeing some sort of theft when you look at the way that productivity has increased for workers ever since the 1900s, and right along with it, wages kept right up with it. And then around the 70s, it broke, and wages have stayed flat. So workers are not being compensated for their increased productivity. Isn't that a form of theft?
First of all, they're not workers. They're people who happen to choose this as a career temporarily. A fact is this. Yes, fast food jobs had food jobs had never been intended to be career jobs. They were intended to be entry-level opportunities to learn a skill.
But we now have this new Reagan economy in which they're permanent jobs.
No, it's the Obama economy that is making so many people like this. Look at the statistics of recent college graduates. They have a future that looks abysmal. But the second point is this. The problem is not minimum wage. The problem is minimum skills. As Mark just pointed out, I'm not for any limit on what people can get if they go out into the marketplace. You are for artificially supporting it out of some need base without realizing that there are going to be consequences.
Making sure that corporations don't drive us into the race to the bottom where we become like Bangladesh. That's what I'm worried about.
But you're blaming Reagan. Obviously, that hasn't happened. We're not like Bangladesh. I guess when you can't blame Bush, you blame Reagan. You keep going further back.
I mean, I
think a lot of these are,
We saw the Matthew Mine explosion. We saw the West Texas explosion. We're seeing workplace
now there's an investigation going forward that may have been intentional and not an accident.
All right. Well, let's move on to the next topic here. So during Wednesday's House hearing, Holder was testifying in front of the House Judiciary Committee on an oversight hearing, and he was pressed by Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee on this particular issue. Take a look.
One of the greatest threats to liberty has been the government taking people's liberty for things that people are in favor of. The Pew Research Group shows that 52% of Americans think marijuana should not be illegal. And yet there are people in jail, and your Justice Departments continue to put people in jail for sale and use, on occasion, of marijuana. You have continued what is allowing the Mexican cartels power, and the power to make money, ruin Mexico, and hurt our country by having a prohibition in the late 20th and 21st century. We saw it.
Horace, I've heard you rail about big government tyranny for a while. Even here tonight, you've probably said big government several times. Congressman Cohen there just said big government. How do you disagree with his reasoning there when it comes to
I think he just completely misplaced the priorities here. But the real, are you? The real question here is, will Mr. Obama and the Democrats in general break off with their relationship with big law enforcement, which is all about setting up controls over guns and drugs, or will he decide to go with the reefers and the weed smokers and all of them and break with the big gun cartel that wants to try to confiscate all of our weapons? This president is more likely to stick with them because of the political benefits that he sees, rather than standing where I think he wants to stand in the room with the reefers.
I think you're right. The president probably has made this decision. He seems to be on
so
choosing
I think
crackdown.
Mr. Cohen needs to talk to the president and not make these public claims that somehow it's Republicans that are driving this.
Well, I think what's interesting about this debate is that actually all the Obama administration is doing is enforcing federal laws that are on the books. What actually needs to happen is for Congress to pass a law that would legalize these drugs, or at least allow states to make their own laws on this issue.
Like with immigration.
Yeah. Wait, I want to. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Well, here's the thing. Richard Nixon declared war on people when he went with the drug war. And then the Reagan administration would just say no, which was I think, a naive approach, but it didn't work. Here's the thing about it. I think a lot of this has to do less with guns, but about private prisons and private prison companies. And I'm for privatization on almost everything, but I say no to prisons. I think that's my law enforcement background. Here's the thing. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act has marijuana as a Schedule I drug. One of the first things, if I say I'm for legalizing pot, somebody's going to say, are you for legalizing heroin? And I have to say, well, maybe not, but that's the counter argument. Then how can heroin and marijuana be in the same schedule? If people say, I'd go give you...
On that point, Mark, I want to play a shot here real quick. Okay. This is, just play the shot. Play the clip.
Is crack worse for a person than marijuana?
I believe all illegal drugs are bad.
Is methamphetamine worse for somebody's health than marijuana?
I don't think any illegal drug is good. Is
heroin worse for someone's health than marijuana?
Again, all
I mean, either yes, no, or I don't know. I mean, if you don't know, you can look this up.
And that's why our drug policies are screwed up. Mark Harold, Kay Steiger, Horace Cooper, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you.
5 years into the Obama presidency, and the right is as powerful as ever and well-financed as ever. How did this happen, and how can progressives fight back? Tom Last, journalist Lee Fang, in tonight's Conversations with Great Minds.
Welcome to the future. Science, technology, innovation. All the latest developments from around Russia. We've got the future covered.
In his secret laboratory, Tim Kirby was able to build the world's most sophisticated robot, which unfortunately doesn't give a darn about anything. Tim's mission? To teach his creation why it should care about humans and world events. This is Why You Should Care.
Watch only on RT.com.
Dangerous experiments on prisoners.
They want to make money, and they have to use healthy guinea pigs in the regular society. They're not able to use prisoners anymore. They wish they could.
Drug tests on human guinea pigs. Paid to pop deadly pills.
He didn't pass away, he was killed. He didn't pass away, they let him die.
Is pharmacy really about helping people?
tonight's Conversations with the Great Minds, I'm joined by Fang. Lee is a reporting fellow with the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute and has covered the complex world of lobbying and public policy for Think Progress, the Boston Globe, and the Nation magazine. One of the first journalists to uncover the network of donors behind the Tea Party, his new book, The Machine, A Field Guide to the Resurgent Right, is a must-read for anyone interested in learning the real story behind the rebirth of the Republican Party in the age of Obama. And Lee, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Just quick correction, I just wrote that one column for the Boston Globe, but I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You do just spectacular work. First, let's start at the beginning. The book, we already showed it on the screen, but the book is called The Machine. Why The Machine?
Well, you know, maybe I could have called it The Jungle or something of that nature, because there's just a kind of complex web of an ecology of, I'm using maybe too many metaphors here, but so many think tanks, funders, PR consultants, lobbyists, you know, trade associations, all of these interconnected groups that combined work towards similar goals, advancing tax cuts for billionaires, pushing austerity, rolling back industrial regulations, rolling back the welfare state. In each kind of cog of this machine is interesting, but the way that that each part interacts with one another and advances similar goals that influence not just public opinion or advance a singular candidate, but reshape the laws that we all live under. That's the machine that I'm trying to talk about here.
Isn't this in many ways the realization of Lewis Powell's suggestion to his next-door neighbor and best friend, I forget his name, the guy who was the president of the
Nixon.
Well, Nixon appointed him to the Supreme Court, but he gave it to he wrote this memo to the
U.S. Chamber of Commerce,
the president, of the U.S. Chamber, back in what, 71, I think.
71. That's
yeah.
correct.
So isn't this the realization of the Powell memo in many ways?
That's right, and you have to kind of put yourself in Powell's shoes in 1971. I mean, this is around the time when the civil rights movement had already deeply affected the nation. The environmental movement was kicking off.
Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, had come out. Unsafe at Any Speed had come out.
That's right. No, you're right. And Ralph Nader, Powell, Ralph Nader struck the fear of God into Powell. You see his name.
He named him in the memo.
Several times. He's saying, if folks like Nader continue to gain popularity on college campuses, continue to inspire these mass movements, we're going to see a fundamental shift in the power structure in the United States. And what he recommended was this similar machine that's described in this book. And you saw out of that memo from Lewis Powell really a network of think tanks, but mostly based in Washington, D.C. The American Enterprise Institute was initially kind of a trade association. The American Enterprise Association, they kind of changed their name. Heritage Foundation, the American Legislative Exchange Council, all of these groups, the Cato Institute, which was originally the Charles Koch Foundation, all of these groups kind of founded in the wake or around the time of the Lewis Powell memo. And what's interesting, and I think a lot of research has already been done on this, is that these types of organizations, this political infrastructure, set into motion the Reagan Revolution all the way through George W. Bush and his big economic domestic policy agenda. What's new about this political machine that I'm talking about in this book is that in the wake of the 2008 elections, you saw the same type of fear that Lewis Powell had in 1971. And
the Republican Party in disarray.
The Republican Party in disarray.
The corporate world concerned.
The Gallup poll showing the Republican Party at the lowest levels of approval rating ever, right? You see the...
I mean, even below Nixon?
Yeah, well, as long as Gallup had been taking those poll numbers. And you saw Democrats, for the first time, not just having big majorities, but big progressive majorities. The Dixiecrats had kind of faded away. You saw pundits kind of almost in a consensus in the media predicting big waves of progressive reform, looking at the partisan alignment, but also saying that look at a public opinion. Folks are tired of this supply side theory. They're tired of the years of Bush and deregulation. They're ready to turn a page. They're ready for a watershed moment of the Employee Free Choice Act, tax reform, big changes that could shift the balance and power, change the kind of trajectory of income inequality that we've been experiencing for so many years.
In other words, there was a consensus that the Reagan experiment, the Reaganomics experiment, had failed. That's right. And that we were going to return to New Deal-onomics.
Yeah, or some
like
kind of mixture.
Society-onomics.
Yeah, exactly. And these conservative planners, these billionaires, saw this moment and they recognized it. And what they did is they started reinvesting in this machine that had been started in the 70s. So you see the same types of think tanks popping up in every single state capital all across the country. That's explored in the book. You see new efforts to hire organizers to develop a new populist movement that could counter kind of the Obama enthusiasm. You see consultants hired to develop a new kind of media ecosystem that can counter the kind of gains made by the left in online media since 2006. You see all of these efforts happening almost at the same time in 2009, 2010, and these planning efforts really reshaped things. They not only stopped a lot of the big progressive reforms in their tracks, they laid the foundation for one of the biggest Republican upset victories in all of American history on the 2010 campaign. And that was very important because that victory trickled down to the state legislatures, and the state legislatures in turn vastly gerrymandered states to make a Democratic majority or a progressive majority that you saw after the 2008 election nearly impossible, at least for the next decade.
Wow. So the situation then was that the Republicans were in disarray. They felt they were doomed. Obama comes into office. He's got this. He had a supermajority until Scott Brown was appointed.
Well, there's the Al Franken issue, but he still had a substantial majority, and I don't think anyone expected that lobbyists would come in and work with Minority Leader Mitch McConnell to abuse the filibuster like he did. But in any case, he had a sizable majority.
But there was this remarkable thing that happened. You know, right about that time, the president is elected, and all of a sudden, there's this Tea Party explosion across the country. And you know, where did this come from? I mean, one of the narratives that has kind of taken hold on the left, I think, is that the Tea Party was this astroturf group, you know, done for economic purposes, but really what they were doing is they were drawing on mostly white racists. Right. You know, the first black guy in the White House, holy cow, we can't have that kind of thing. To what extent is that narrative true versus it was really a genuine astroturf organization, or I guess that's an oxymoron, but I mean, what is it? What happened here?
I think it was a combination of a lot of factors. And what's interesting in the book, or at least what's new and novel, is that, you know, there's always been a kind of a friction in the Republican Party. And that there was a tidy relationship between the Reagan years and the Bush years, where big business Republicans had compromised with social conservatives, and evangelicals, folks motivated by religion or abortion, some of these hot-button issues, had provided kind of the foot soldiers to the kind of purely economic lobbyist types.
The Jerry Falwells and Ralph Reeds of the world.
Right, the moral majority, the Christian coalition types, they had worked with the Republican Party for a good 30 years. And that relationship started fraying in the end of 2008, not only because of demographic reasons, but also because of the scandals, the sex scandals that came out in the last years of the Bush years. And we see this relationship falling apart. We see even at the end of 2008, Focus on the Family, this big social conservative group, laying off a lot of their staff just because, you know, they're losing popularity, they don't have the same clout. At the same time, and this is a little bit of a different perspective, libertarians and corporate lobbyists had been tinkering with and developing their own social movement based almost solely on economic issues, but generating it not on religion, but on a different idea of the birth of this nation, not on the Christian fundamentalist view, but on this kind of myth that the Boston Tea Party symbolized the creation of America, and that the Boston Tea Party was somehow this anti-government, anti-tax rebellion that defines who we are as a people. And I kind of explore how this idea was used in 1993. There were tobacco lobbyists who wanted to fight the Clinton health care plan. And they said, as Philip Morris, we can't go out there and fight this excise tax that was planned to use to pay for Clinton's health reform plan. as Philip Morris, we need a third-party validator. So why don't we develop a Tea Party? So they went out and they hired
literally that phrase.
Not just the phrase, the imagery, the flags. They went and hired PR firms, corporate PR firms, to go to Kentucky, go to D.C., and organize these rallies.
And this is 93.
This is 93. It just didn't take off. I mean, they had these rallies. It just didn't have cachet. And we see this over and over again. In 1997, Dick Armey, with a set of other Republican congressmen, they go to Boston. At that moment, they're working with a bunch of corporate lobbyists that are trying to push the flat tax. They want to get rid of the progressive income tax and replace it with a flat tax, everyone paying the same amount. They dump tea in the harbor. They launch all these, organizations to support a new Boston Tea Party to support the flat tax. They were just kind of lampooned in the media. No one took them seriously. And we see the Koch brothers, their group, Citizens for a Sound Economy, which changed to Americans for Prosperity, this kind of grassroots organizing group, trying to develop tea parties in 2003, 2004, going to places like Michigan and North Carolina, organizing rallies, busing people. The problem was the time just wasn't right. And we see in 2007, 2008, a group of libertarian billionaires developing a think tank called the Sam Adams Alliance in Chicago that's basically just a think tank to develop populist ideas. And they're literally giving out $1,000, $5,000 grants to folks who will go out and do courageous Tea Party activism. So they seeded this idea, and they had a template for it. A lot of these folks are the same actors that became the leaders of the Tea Party movement in early 2009. Literally, Dick Armey and Americans for Prosperity, they had tried this before.
So they're the leftover from the tobacco industry, they tried it, then the flat tax industry, they tried it, but this time, did it catch on this time because they were genuinely under siege, or because of the element of an African American in the White House, or was it both?
I think it was both. It was a lot of planning, a lot of money, but a lot of good circumstance. Because Obama also, you can't just blame these quote-unquote AstroTurf groups. You have to also blame Obama. Obama took his grassroots organizing group and folded it into the DNC and kind of left it there. He stopped using the populist rhetoric, and he actually stopped using the populist tactics early in his administration. He also did a lot of things that kind of engendered populist outrage by refusing to claw back those banker bonuses from all those banks that were bailed out by TARP. Pretty much just opening the field for populist anger for anyone to swoop in.
So in a way, he set it up. That's remarkable. More of tonight's Conversations with the Great Minds with Lee Fang right after the break.
Your language.
Informativo NRT.
Want news, programs, and documentaries in Spanish? What matters to you? Breaking news, alternative angles, hidden stories. Are you here? Then try RT Spanish. To find out more, visit actualidad.rt.com.
Permission free. Accreditation free. Transport charges free. Arrangement free. Risk free. Stereotype free. Download free broadcast quality video for your media projects at freevideo.rt.com.
Welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. Tonight, I'm joined by Lee Fang, reporting fellow for the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute and author of the new book, The Machine, A Field Guide to the Resurgent Right. So, Lee, this isn't, we've been talking about the Tea Party and this whole kind of national thing and the Republican, or Philip Morris starting this in '93. This is all at a national level. And yet, when you look at, I grew up in Michigan, and Michigan was always a labor state. I mean, it was always a blue state. I think it arguably still is a blue state, except that we have a Republican Senate, a Republican House, and a Republican governor. And Michigan just lost, it just got this right to work for less law passed. It's like
the ground has shifted.
The state, somehow, and yet I still have a lot of family there. I go back there every year. I don't think the ground has shifted at the level of the people. It seems more like, well, I'm not really sure what's going on, other than the DeVos family and an enormous amount of money being dumped into that state. What is happening at the individual state levels around this country, and how is it coming about? How did Michigan and Wisconsin happen?
Well, simply put, it takes less money to buy a state, right? State politics is much cheaper than on the federal level. And in 2009, when Republicans saw Democrats, progressives, controlling the gears of power on the White House and Congress, they made a concentrated effort to build up their infrastructure in the states, the political infrastructure.
Was this in anticipation of the census, which the Constitution says every 10 years, every year that ends with 0, we have to do a national census and then redraw congressional districts based on that?
Yeah,
or was this just coincidental with 2008?
It was explicitly part of the plan. Ed Gillespie, this Republican strategist and lobbyist who's been around forever, but he almost immediately went to work in late 2009 in helping with these efforts and providing funds and setting up some of these so-called 501c4 groups that started working in the states to elect more Republican state legislators. But some of the big money folks went in and created new think tanks that would foster, nurture existing state-based conservative think tanks in state capitals. And in addition, created a new group called the Franklin Center that their stated mission was, we've had this financial crisis where all of these reporters are being laid off. You have state capitals that are being covered by no one, except for maybe one AP reporter. This is our opportunity to go in and change the news. So they went out and hired at least 100 former journalists, but to report from a conservative view, blaming the budget crisis only on teachers, or saying that the only way to fix, a problem in the state would be to remove collective bargaining rights or roll back some other union right. So this was all kind of happening at once. In some states where there are already conservative state-based think tanks, like Michigan, the Mackinac Center, you see their budgets increasing almost immediately.
But we never, I knew about the Mackinac Center for years. Nobody ever really took them seriously. That, and there was some other guy in the northern part of Michigan who was, constantly doing ballot initiatives and things. And they were considered right-wing crackpots. And, other than the only right-wingers that were really taken seriously were the DeVos family, out of Grand Rapids, whose nephew, I guess, Eric Prince, turned a little shooting range into Blackwater and is now hiding out in the Middle East. So continue with your story.
Well, Mackinac Center, which you're right, it's existed for a very long time. You see their budget increasing sharply. You see them hiring all of these former broadcast and print journalists who had been laid off, or in their words, close to laid off. And in other states like Wisconsin, at the time, completely controlled by Democrats, Democratic governors, Democratic legislature, very pro-union. You see these conservative planners going in, funding an existing think tank, Wisconsin Public Policy Foundation, but then creating a new kind of action-oriented think tank called the McIver Institute. And the McIver Institute doesn't come out with academic papers like a traditional think tank. Their purpose is to drive public opinion and to lobby the legislature. So they're hiring folks to just get video cameras and go out and film union rallies, to go out and conduct polls that pressure Republican politicians to take on unions. So you either see existing state-based conservative think tanks grow rapidly after 2009, or in states where there isn't much conservative infrastructure, new think tanks are founded. And these organizations started laying the groundwork for not only big victories in 2010, but big political victories in 2010 in terms of electing Republicans, but big policy victories after those Republicans get in. We can look at the history of campaign finance, and something's fundamentally changed here, because not only are campaigns won on election day, but you see this permanent drumbeat every day, even after election day, where these infrastructure organizations are pushing very far-right legislature, really very far-right policies on the legislature, and their left counterparts don't have really an equivalent organization. So a lot of these folks in Michigan and Wisconsin are simply kind of swamped. They didn't see what was coming, and I don't think they're still prepared.
And they don't have the resources.
Well, in Michigan is a good example. The kind of union-backed organization that does media and political research has, I believe, about $700,000 annual budget. Mackinac Center, Americans for Prosperity Michigan, and one of these media outlets combined have about $5 million.
Wow. Here's an interesting anecdote. In 2003, when we started our radio show, the first network that picked us up was called IE America Radio. It was out of Detroit. It was owned by the UAW. And we were on stations all over the country and on Sirius satellite radio. And the UAW pulled the plug on that network the day that Air America started and just said, okay, that's it. We're going to roll this over to Air America. And but that was kind of the progressive infrastructure. I mean, and it was basically the entire network had 3 employees. I mean, it was just this little thing run out of this little office. They did a lot with little in Detroit. And now there's, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, I look around and I don't see any progressive infrastructure anywhere, at least anything that would, outside of, the established union infrastructures, which are under siege everywhere you look. I don't see anything growing. Is there an equivalent?
There's a fundamental asymmetry, I suppose.
Yeah.
You look, one of these state-based think tanks, one in Texas, just like the Mackinac Center, Texas Public Policy Foundation, they accidentally spilled their donor list in 2010. So we got a look at how these groups operate from the inside. So while, yeah, unions provide funds for semi-similar organizations on the left, corporations make up the difference on the right, because a corporation can provide funding to this type of political infrastructure and get a clear return. They're getting a tax cut. They're getting help fighting regulation. And then this is important because through a lobbyist, everyone knows it's coming from, Verizon or Texaco or whatever. But these organizations are a third-party validator because they typically don't disclose their donors, but they can go out and just as aggressively lobby for these same goals. And you look at the Texas Public Policy Center, or Texas Public Policy Foundation, how they've grown so quickly. A lot of that money is just corporate money from Fortune 100 companies that are seeing, I suppose, a very big return on investment by funding these conservative infrastructure groups.
Yeah, I've seen some studies. In fact, you might have been the source of one of them, that one of the most profitable businesses in the United States is investing in members of Congress. That there are companies that have had literally returns of over 10,000% on investments in particular pieces of legislation.
Pharmaceuticals are a great example of this, but traditionally big business has funded 50-50 Democrats, Republicans, and they've mostly funded candidates.
Or they were apolitical even.
Or if they're
before the 70s anyway.
Exactly, but in even in the mid-90s, you see all the big kind of Fortune 100 companies basically splitting down the middle. There's some aberrations, like the oil companies have been more pro-Republican, some of the broadcasts a little bit more pro-Democrat. But what we're seeing a big difference here is not only are the campaign donations shifting more Republican, but that these corporations are now funding political infrastructure, ideological infrastructure, the stuff that boosts the Tea Party as part of their, I suppose, their business model.
Right. So it's like the Powell memo revisited on steroids. So what's the role that the Koch brothers play in all this? They get a lot of publicity as kind of the granddaddies of this. Their father, Fred Koch, started the John Birch Society. My dad took me to a John Birch Society meeting when I was a little kid.
Yeah.
I remember it, and I remember the signs, Peach Earl Warren, they were so freaked out about Brown versus Board. What is there significance in their role? Exaggerated? Are they just the boogeymen of the press on the left, or is there something going on there?
Fred Koch, one of the founders of the John Birch Society, he was very paranoid, thought that the civil rights movement was a Kremlin conspiracy for African Americans to take over U.S. citizens, or U.S. cities, excuse me. And he actually had kind of a reason to be paranoid. I have one little scoop in the book about how the FBI was actually monitoring him because he was saying such crazy stuff. Yeah. But no, the Koch brothers, in one sense, they are like a lot of these Republican donors who provide tons of money into politics. But what makes them unique is that Richard Fink, one of their top lobbyists, one of their top advisors, kind of pioneered this model that sets them apart from any other big conservative donor. And he said, well, we idolize Friedrich Hayek, the libertarian academic. And Hayek has this model of the production process. You have to mine the raw material or extract it. You have to bring it to your factory. You've got to refine it or process it, manufacture it, market it, distribute it, sell it. Well, he said, why don't we take this process that's fundamental to our capitalistic system and apply it to politics? So what's unique about the Koch brothers is that they fund every level of how public policy and public opinion are shaped. So they have thousands of grants and scholarships to high school and college students to take up these conservative ideas. They fund professorships and endowed chairs at universities all over the country. They not only fund, of course, so many think tanks here in Washington, D.C., but think tanks across the country, including that Texas Public Policy Foundation we found out from the disclosure list. But above that, their Political Action Committee is, of course, one of the most active. They've got the grassroots groups like Americans for Prosperity. They're very active in dark money and just airing constant attack ads or issue-based propaganda. They've got a system where they can shape whether we're talking about health reform, climate change, tax policy. They can have people on TV and folks walking around talking to legislators all the time. And the meeting last weekend is another good example. The Koch brothers convene these twice annual meetings of other conservative donors, sometimes Supreme Court justices, sometimes politicians.
They've just decided to double down.
And they've decided to double down. They had another one of their big meetings.
We have to wrap it up. Lee Fang, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Tom.
Great
I really appreciate it.
You're doing great work. Lee Fang. To see this and other conversations with great minds, go to our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com.